bit now is to go into some of the policy stuff. I'm going to talk, I'm not going to go into everything in detail, but I want to point out a few things that are, you'll typically run into and that are pretty useful. Before we start with that, does anybody have any questions on the stuff that we talked about earlier on? Everyone's kind of following along with that, all right, and comfortable with it? Okay.
You won't be truly comfortable with it until
Yeah.
you deploy it about 30 times.
Yeah.
Watch me.
Keep it on your toes.
Gotta get your hands dirty a little bit to really understand what's going on. So there's a number of different types of policy enforcement elements that show up under the policies menu. We've talked a little bit already about the captive portal and redirecting someone to a splash portal. There's more that we can go into on that, but we're gonna skip over that for right at the moment. We'll kind of like run through here. It's all relatively self-explanatory, with the exception of a couple in the middle here. Content filtering is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about that a little bit more tomorrow, I believe, or maybe Thursday. But we have both web as well as DNS-based content filtering in the system now. Our event triggers is what we talked about before. There's quota event triggers. We have the ability to trigger policy shifts when a particular device on the network is abusing the network in some way. Maybe they're opening a huge number of TCP states and kind of overloading the box in that way. So we can set a particular limit that we want to manage our overall states on the system and prevent one system from really just opening tons and tons of connections. Typically, if that's happening, there's something wrong with that device, some sort of malware or something like that. We also have, as I mentioned, the ability to do deep packet inspection and trigger events based on the behavioral patterns that we see in that traffic. So things like the BitTorrent detection and stuff like that Simon mentioned gets done through a snort trigger. There's the ability to do things like detecting certain activity, like let's say there's a device on the network that's opening a large number of SMTP connections, something like that. Typically that means that there's something on that computer that shouldn't be there, some sort of like mailer virus, that sort of thing. Especially when you're dealing with a situation where you have a lot of people sharing one public IP address or a few public IP addresses, that can be pretty detrimental, yeah.
You mentioned BitTorrent, so you have a database of all the signatures that you analyze through traffic?
There are, let me pull that up, there's several remote signature databases that you can pull from to get those types of signatures. So under remote DPI signatures, when you create a new record, it'll automatically fill that out, and we'll give this a second here to go through and download that list. But basically that will pull in a list of categories that it will be able to categorize traffic based on, and that's coming from the emerging threats database, which is kind of a user submitted and maintained list of different types of triggers.
Okay.
So you can see there's a long list of different categories, but one of those is peer-to-peer. So all of these categories have within them a whole bunch of different rules, and from time to time, some of those rules you may find will trigger some false positives, that kind of thing. So we can go in and actually like whitelist some of those rules or prevent
You
those.
customize it a bit, if you like, or you're going to sample some.
Yeah, so you can, when one of these rules gets triggered, you'll have the rule ID, and you can go in and actually look at that particular rule and kind of make a judgment of whether that's something that you actually want to be blocking or not. You also have the ability to create your own rules, so you can just go in and make your own DPI signature here you can go in and look at those databases and get a sense of like how the syntax of all of that and bring those over.
The best part is that those are free, right?
I was just gonna say, being that it's open source, I guess,
It's free, it's community maintained, all downloaded through the internet. Now, your customers expect to pay for that, right? So this is leverage.
Do you have maybe some advice? What are the minimum that you recommend to use? Let's say a public event or whatever.
So one of the things that I always recommend is the max connection trigger. Generally speaking, you shouldn't really be seeing devices that are creating upwards of 500, 1,000 states, like simultaneous states. Typically when that's happening, that indicates there's something strange going on in that system. And, there are different ways to configure the triggers as far as what happens when one of these events, gets fired. So if you want, you can just have it basically alert you to that and not even change the policy at all. And then we also have the ability to shift them into a different group temporarily, and that creates those transient group memberships that I talked about. So the max connection trigger is one that's good to have in place, generally speaking. I will often do an SMTP trigger, which basically will, if you detect more than, let's say, 20 SMTP email connections coming within a minute, usually that's not somebody furiously typing out emails. Usually there's something going on there. So something like that. And then really depending on the environment, if you're deploying to the type of place where they want to block the BitTorrent traffic, doing something like that. And just depending on what the end user base is, you can kind of play around with that a little bit. Definitely, I would say the max connection trigger is the one that I would just recommend as kind of a default to put that in place. I don't know if we even have that on this network or not. No. But all of these are fairly straightforward in their configuration. So just give it a name, and then it gets attached to a particular policy. And so one thing that you want to keep in mind as you're dealing with these triggers, and as I mentioned before, the whole concept of the policy is not cascading down between the different groups that you may happen to be a member of at any given time. It's whatever is your active policy, that's the policy that's in place, and only that policy. So given that, when let's say they've got our free user group who's got a trigger for BitTorrent traffic, and we want to move them into a group that has a lower bandwidth queue, for example. You need to keep in mind that the things that you had applied to the free policy, if you move them into a different policy that doesn't have those elements attached anymore, then you're no longer enforcing those rules. So if you want to continue detecting that type of behavior, you want to make sure that the trigger is attached to the policy of the group that you're moving the person into as well.
So you have to set everything in every policy.
Exactly. So that's a key thing to understand, because that tends to bite people sometimes if you just think, oh, I want to trigger, this person triggered this event, and now I just want to make a policy with a 2 meg queue or something. That's great, but if you are not adding everything else into that policy, then you essentially opened up other possibilities for that user by trying to penalize them in some way, and you actually might end up creating a situation where they can do something that they couldn't do before.
There's a copy function, right, on policies?
No. There isn't.
Is there something that you can apply a policy to every type of user, or something like all?
To
Sort of like create a policy and add users to that particular policy.
well, in any policy, it can be attached to multiple groups.
Gotcha.
So you can share a policy between different types of users. You just can't have more than one policy apply to a particular group.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry, you said you can't have more than one policy, what?
Attached to one group. Each group has a singular policy association, and when that group is your highest precedence match for your device, that's the policy. And it's important to be able to have clarity in that to know exactly what's the policy that's in place for that particular user.